Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same chilling tone, articulate style, and narrative structure, while altering the word order and sentence construction. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. One winter in 1847, something arrived in the remote mountain town of Millbrook, Vermont, that would haunt the survivors for all their remaining days. They called him Samuel Hawthorne, though that name is found in no official records from before that terrible February night when he emerged from a blizzard which had claimed 17 lives across Windham County. What the townspeople would discover about this man, who spoke of distant lands beyond the mountains and demonstrated medical knowledge saving dozens during a deadly winter fever outbreak, would shake their faith in human nature itself, revealing truths about survival that civilized minds refused to accept. For over 170 years, the Millbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents locked away from public view, documents detailing not just who Samuel Hawthorne really was, but what he had done to survive in those frozen peaks, and more terrifyingly, what he continued to do long after his rescue. The truth about Samuel Hawthorne is more than a story of survival gone wrong. It stands as a testament to how far a human being can fall when civilization is stripped away, and how monsters can hide behind the masks of saviors, slowly converting entire communities to their twisted philosophy of existence. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Hawthorne and the winter that changed Millbrook forever, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, for stories like this one dig deep into America's darkest historical secrets. Tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, as you might be surprised how many similar disappearances happened in your area during those harsh winters of the 1840s. A pattern of mysterious vanishings followed Samuel Hawthorne's path through New England, affecting over 60 families across 4 states, with the authorities never connecting the dots until it was far too late. The records I'm about to share with you come from sources never digitized, never made public, and for good reason. They contain details about human nature that most people aren't prepared to confront. Millbrook, Vermont in 1847 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, or so they thought. Nestled in a valley between the Green Mountains, roughly 40 miles northeast of Bennington, the town's population barely scratched 300 souls. Most of them were farmers, loggers, and their families, trying to make an honest living from unforgiving land. The settlement had been established in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans seeking cheap land and a fresh start. But by the 1840s, it had become one of those forgotten communities existing in the gaps between larger towns, connected to the outside world only by treacherous mountain roads that became impossible for months during winter. The winter of 1846–47 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that the town's doctor, Ezekiel Putnam, a Harvard-educated physician who had come to Millbrook in 1843 seeking a simpler life after losing his Boston practice to gambling debts, recorded in his journal that whiskey froze solid in bottles left overnight. The Connecticut River, which normally provided the town with fresh water and a trade route, had frozen to a depth of 4 feet by January. Even the hardiest locals, men like Norwegian immigrant Henrik Bergstrom, a man who had survived winters in the Arctic Circle, spoke of this season as unlike anything they had experienced. The town's heart was Main Street, a muddy thoroughfare in summer and a frozen wasteland in winter, lined with Jeremiah Prescott's general store. This 2-story wooden building served as the community's primary source of supplies and its unofficial news center. Prescott, a shrewd merchant who had moved from Connecticut in 1839, kept meticulous records of every transaction and every piece of gossip that passed through his establishment. His ledgers would later become crucial evidence for understanding the extent of Samuel Hawthorne's influence over the community. At the eastern end of Main Street stood the Millbrook Inn, run by the widow Abigail Foresk. Mrs. Foresk, whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years prior, maintained rooms for the occasional travelers stranded in Millbrook during their mountain journeys. Her inn also served as the town's informal social center, where farmers and loggers would gather on winter evenings to drink corn whiskey, play cards, and share news from the outside world. Dominating the town square was the modest white church, where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield delivered sermons to increasingly thin congregations. Greenfield, a stern Congregationalist minister educated at Yale, had arrived in Millbrook in 1844 with dreams of building a strong Christian community in the wilderness. By the winter of 1847, however, His congregation was struggling with doubts that went far deeper than the typical challenges of frontier life. The harsh realities of surviving in such an isolated place were testing everyone's faith in divine providence. Most families lived in simple wooden houses heated by whatever firewood they could gather before the snows made the forests impassable. The more prosperous residents, like Thomas and Grace Thornbury, who owned the largest farm in the valley and employed several local men as seasonal workers, had two-story homes with multiple fireplaces and cellars for storing preserved food. The Thornburys had 3 children: Sarah, 12 years old and already helping with household duties; Mary, 8 years old and known for her bright curiosity; and young William, just 5 years old and the apple of his mother's eye. By February of 1847, Millbrook was struggling in ways that went beyond typical winter hardships. The community had already lost 5 residents to the cold and disease. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger beloved by children for his stories of trolls and northern lights, had been found frozen in his cabin after his chimney collapsed during a January blizzard. Margaret Fairchild's baby had died of pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's best efforts, leaving the young mother in a state of grief so profound she barely spoke anymore. Most concerning was the growing shortage of food and medical supplies. The last supply wagons had arrived in late November, and no one expected relief until the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Dr. Putnam's medical supplies were nearly exhausted. He was down to his last bottles of laudanum and quinine, and his surgical instruments were showing signs of wear that made him anxious about performing even basic procedures. People were beginning to whisper about a cursed winter that had settled over their small community like a burial shroud, and some of the older residents spoke in hushed tones about abandoning Millbrook entirely when spring arrived. It was into this desperate, isolated world that Samuel Hawthorne emerged from the storm, carrying with him knowledge and supplies that seemed too good to be true. And as the townspeople would discover, they were. February 18, 1847, a date burned into the memory of every Millbrook family that survived what came after, recorded not just in Dr. Putnam's medical journals, but in the personal diaries of at least 6 residents who documented the strange events beginning that night. Young Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's 14-year-old son, was the first to spot the figure stumbling down the mountain path in the middle of a blizzard that had already buried the valley under 3 feet of new snow since dawn. The boy had been checking the store's rear windows for ice damage when he saw what looked like a walking corpse silhouetted against the white fury of the storm. His first instinct was to dismiss the figure as a hallucination from staring too long into the swirling snow. But as he watched, the shape resolved into an unmistakably human form. The figure moved with purpose, following the winding path down from the high peaks with a confidence that seemed impossible in such conditions. Most travelers caught in blizzards wandered randomly until they collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. This person walked as if following a map only he could see. The boy called for his father, and within minutes, half the men in town had gathered at Prescott's store to watch the stranger's approach. What they saw defied their understanding of what was possible in such weather. The figure walked upright against winds that were bending trees nearly horizontal. His pace was steady, unhurried, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll through pleasant weather instead of battling conditions that had already killed several travelers that winter. Samuel Hawthorne arrived at death's door, or so it seemed. His clothes were strange, made of materials folks in Millbrook had never seen before. The outer garment appeared to be a long coat or cloak fashioned from what looked like treated animal hide, but the texture was unlike any leather the local farmers and hunters recognized. It was thick, almost armor-like, and seemed to repel snow rather than absorb it. Underneath, he wore layered clothing made from a tightly woven fabric that looked almost metallic in certain light. His boots were perhaps the most puzzling aspect of his appearance. They were constructed in a way that left peculiar tracks in the snow deeper than ordinary boots would make, with a distinctive pattern that included what looked like metal studs or spikes arranged in geometric designs. Dr. Putnam later sketched these tracks in his journal, noting they were unlike any footwear manufactured in New England or any European pattern with which he was familiar. The boots appeared designed specifically for traversing difficult terrain in extreme weather, suggesting a level of craftsmanship and specialized knowledge inconsistent with Hawthorne's claim to come from a simple mountain community. But it was Hawthorne's physical condition that first truly unsettled the townspeople. Despite having allegedly wandered through a killing blizzard for what he claimed were many days and nights, he showed none of the signs of severe frostbite that should have claimed his fingers and toes. His cheeks were ruddy with cold, yes, but his extremities were perfectly intact. His movement was fluid and coordinated, and his speech was clear and articulate. Dr. Putnam examined him thoroughly and found this so remarkable that he wrote extensively about it, theorizing that Hawthorne must have had access to shelter and proper supplies far more recently than his story suggested. The man himself was tall and lean, standing well over 6 feet, with dark hair prematurely streaked with white, though he appeared to be no more than 35 years old. His build suggested someone accustomed to physical labor and harsh conditions. His hands were calloused and scarred, his shoulders broad from years of carrying heavy loads, his legs powerful from walking long distances over difficult terrain. But it was his face that people remembered most clearly. His features were sharp and angular with high cheekbones and a prominent nose that gave him an almost predatory appearance. His skin was weathered but healthy, with none of the pallor or signs of malnutrition expected from a wilderness survivor. Most memorable were his eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in certain light, like ice over deep water. The way he looked at people made them deeply uncomfortable, as if he was measuring them for something they couldn't understand. Children found him fascinating as they might be drawn to a dangerous animal, while adults instinctively felt the need to keep their distance. Several residents later described the unsettling sensation that Hawthorne was cataloging everything he saw, memorizing the layout of their homes, their family routines, the relationships and hierarchies within the community. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, but with an accent no one in Millbrook could place. It wasn't British, despite some similarities. It wasn't German or Scandinavian, though there were hints of those influences. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled extensively, described it as an accent that seems to borrow from many sources while belonging to none. Hawthorne's vocabulary was extensive and precise, suggesting formal education, but he occasionally used words or phrases that seemed archaic or simply unfamiliar to his listeners. His story, when he finally told it, was both compelling and deeply unsettling. He claimed to come from beyond the Great Peaks, from valleys where the sun shines differently and the seasons follow older patterns. When pressed for specifics about this homeland, he would become vague, speaking of my people and the homeland across the white fields, where the old ways still guide the wise. He described a community living in harmony with the harshest aspects of nature, where survival depended not on fighting the wilderness, but on understanding its deeper rhythms and accepting its necessary cruelties. Children found him fascinating, gathering around whenever he spoke to listen to his stories of distant places and strange customs. Adults found him deeply unsettling but couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about the way he moved, the way he observed everything, the way his pale eyes seemed to see through people that triggered instinctive alarm in anyone who spent more than a few minutes in his presence. The most disturbing aspect of Samuel Hawthorne's arrival, however, was what he carried with him. In a leather satchel that never left his side, a bag made from the same strange weather-resistant material as his clothing, he kept what he called his medicines and tools of survival. The contents of this bag would later become the source of the town's greatest nightmares. But in those first days, desperate as they were for any kind of help, the people of Millbrook welcomed what seemed like divine intervention in their darkest hour. That first night, as Hawthorne sat by the fire in the Millbrook Inn, warming himself with a mug of Mrs. Forestk's strongest coffee, he began to demonstrate the knowledge that would make him indispensable to the community. When young Sarah Thornbury began coughing violently, a symptom that had been growing worse and had Dr. Putnam worried about consumption, Hawthorne listened carefully and immediately diagnosed the problem as a respiratory infection from breathing too much smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces. From his mysterious satchel, he produced a small vial containing a dark liquid that smelled of pine needles and something else, something sweet and organic that no one could identify. He instructed Sarah to take just 3 drops mixed with warm water before bedtime. Within an hour, her coughing had subsided significantly. By morning, she was breathing normally for the first time in weeks. Word of this miraculous cure spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and by the end of Samuel Hawthorne's first full day in town, half the community was lined up outside the inn, hoping for relief from various ailments that had been plaguing them. Within days of his arrival, Samuel Hawthorne had established himself as Millbrook's unofficial second doctor, though his methods were unlike anything the town's people had ever witnessed. Dr. Putnam, initially skeptical of anyone claiming medical knowledge without formal training, became grudgingly impressed with the stranger's diagnostic abilities and the effectiveness of his treatments. Hawthorne could diagnose ailments at a glance, identifying conditions that had puzzled Putnam for weeks. He knew exactly which herbs to gather even in the dead of winter, somehow locating medicinal plants buried under feet of snow. And most remarkably, his treatments worked with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. When little Sarah Thornbury developed what Dr. Putnam feared was consumption, the same disease that had killed 3 people in Millbrook the previous winter, Hawthorne prepared a strange concoction that involved boiling certain roots with what he claimed was preserved meat from mountain game, prepared according to the old traditions of my people. The process took several hours and required ingredients Hawthorne produced from various containers in his seemingly bottomless leather satchel. The smell that emanated from his cooking pot was unlike anything the townspeople had encountered, sweet and sickly, with an underlying odor that reminded several residents of the time Henrik Bergstrom's body hadn't been found for nearly a week. Mrs. Foresk, who prided herself on her knowledge of cooking and preserving foods, couldn't identify any of the scents. When she asked about his ingredients, he smiled mysteriously and explained that his people had developed these preservation techniques over many generations of surviving in the harshest mountain conditions. The medicine worked. Sarah recovered completely within 3 days, though she complained of vivid nightmares filled with snow and hungry eyes watching her from dark places. She described dreams of walking through endless white landscapes where shadowy figures called to her in languages she didn't understand, promising warmth and food if she would only join them in their sacred feast. Her mother, Grace Thornbury, was so grateful for her daughter's recovery that she insisted Hawthorne stay in their family's spare room above the kitchen, despite her husband Thomas's reservations about hosting a stranger about whom they knew so little. It was Grace who first noticed Hawthorne's peculiar habits and began to document them in letters to her sister in Albany, letters that were never sent, but which were preserved in the Thornbury family papers and provided crucial evidence for later investigators. Hawthorne never slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, always with one ear listening as if expecting something to find him. He would wake several times each night and spend long periods sitting motionless by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an intensity that made Grace deeply uncomfortable. He would disappear for hours during the worst storms, claiming he needed to gather certain plants and materials for his medicines. These expeditions seemed impossible given the weather conditions, winds that made it dangerous for experienced outdoorsmen to venture far, temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours. Yet Hawthorne would return from these mysterious journeys with his strange boots barely wet and carrying items that shouldn't have been available in the Vermont wilderness during winter. Fresh meat was the most puzzling of his acquisitions. While local hunters hadn't seen game for weeks and were surviving on preserved stores, Hawthorne regularly returned with what he claimed were rabbits, deer, and other forest animals he had trapped or hunted. The meat looked fresh and was skillfully prepared, cut into precise portions he claimed were traditional methods. But several of the more experienced hunters noticed that the cuts didn't look quite right. The bone structure seemed wrong for the animals Hawthorne claimed they came from, and the meat itself had a texture and color that didn't match local game. Dr. Putnam, whose medical training had included some study of anatomy, became increasingly suspicious. During one examination of the portions Hawthorne used in his medicines, Putnam noticed what appeared to be cuts of meat that looked remarkably similar to human muscle tissue. When he raised this concern, Hawthorne laughed and explained that his people had developed techniques for preparing meat that could make even the toughest animals tender and nutritious. "You must understand, Doctor," Hawthorne said with his unsettling smile, "that survival in the true wilderness requires one to abandon the squeamish attitudes of civilized society. My people learned long ago that all meat is essentially the same. It provides the nutrients needed to sustain life regardless of its original source. The important thing is proper preparation and the spiritual attitude with which one consumes what nature provides." Grace found him one morning carefully cleaning what appeared to be a woman's silver locket, polishing it with a soft cloth while humming a tune she'd never heard, but which seemed hauntingly familiar. The melody was simple but deeply unsettling, with a rhythm that reminded her of funeral dirges. When she asked about the locket, he smiled that unsettling smile and said, "It belonged to a dear friend from home who couldn't make the journey, but whose spirit travels with me always." But Grace could have sworn she'd seen that exact locket before, around the neck of Rebecca Henley, the wife of merchant James Henley, who had disappeared with her husband during a trip to Albany the previous autumn. The Henleys had been traveling through the mountain passes when an early storm trapped them, and despite extensive searches, no trace had ever been found. The locket was distinctive, silver with an intricate floral pattern that Rebecca's grandmother had brought from Ireland. Grace had admired it many times. The stranger's room became a source of growing unease for the Thornbury family. Strange sounds emanated from it at night, soft scraping noises like someone working with small tools, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like muffled crying or whimpering. The sounds were so faint they might have been dismissed as settling wood or wind, but they followed patterns that suggested deliberate activity. When Grace's husband, Thomas, finally worked up the courage to ask, Hawthorne explained he was working on maps to guide me back home when spring arrives and journals to record the wisdom I've learned during my time among your people. He showed Thomas elaborate drawings on what looked like treated animal hide marked with symbols and notations that made no sense to anyone in Millbrook. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing topographical features, weather patterns, and travel routes through terrain that seemed far more extensive than anything visible from Millbrook. But the maps told a disturbing story for anyone who looked closely enough. They detailed every path through the surrounding mountains, every cave and shelter, every place where a person might take refuge. More troubling still, they included notations in a language none could read, marking certain locations with symbols that looked disturbingly like tally marks. Some areas were marked with what appeared to be numbers, suggesting Hawthorne was keeping count of something or someone. Dr. Putnam, whose curiosity about Hawthorne's methods had evolved into genuine suspicion, began keeping his own detailed notes about his colleagues' behavior and the effects of his treatments. What he documented would later become crucial evidence. The first disturbing pattern Putnam noticed was in the way Hawthorne's patients responded to his treatments. While the immediate effects were invariably positive, symptoms disappeared, strength returned, there were subtle changes in behavior that became apparent over time. Patients began to crave meat with an unusual intensity, especially given the limited protein available. They also displayed increased aggression and territorial behavior, becoming protective of their food stores in ways that went beyond normal rationing instincts. More troubling were the psychological changes. Several began experiencing similar nightmares, dreams of walking through snowy landscapes populated by shadowy figures who offered them sustenance in exchange for joining their eternal feast. These dreams were so vivid and consistent that Putnam began to suspect some form of shared psychological influence, possibly through ingredients in Hawthorne's medicines that affected brain function. The breaking point in Dr. Putnam's growing suspicions came when he decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's medicine preparations. Using a microscope he kept for examining tissue samples, Putnam discovered what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments in a powder that Hawthorne claimed was made from ground antler and medicinal roots. When confronted with this evidence, Hawthorne's reaction was swift and chilling. Rather than denying the findings, he seemed pleased. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes gleaming with admiration. "I had hoped someone in this community would possess the intelligence to understand the true nature of my work." "Yes, you are correct. The most effective medicines are those that incorporate elements from the ultimate source of life, human beings themselves." Putnam's blood ran cold as Hawthorne continued. "In my homeland, we learned long ago that the human body contains within it all the elements necessary to heal and strengthen other human bodies. When prepared properly, according to sacred traditions, human tissue becomes the most powerful medicine available. It creates a bond between those who share in its consumption, a communion that goes far deeper than anything your Christian sacraments could achieve." The implications hit Putnam like a physical blow. Not only was this man feeding human remains to the townspeople as medicine, but he was doing so as part of a deliberate plan to psychologically condition them to accept cannibalism as normal and beneficial. The nightmares, the behavioral changes, the craving for meat, all of it was part of a systematic process of breaking down psychological barriers. As February melted into March, the situation in Millbrook took an increasingly dark turn. Samuel Hawthorne's medical successes continued to mount, but so did the strange incidents. Dr. Putnam kept detailed notes about his mysterious colleague's methods, partly out of medical curiosity, and partly due to growing suspicions that something profoundly disturbing was happening. Hawthorne's medical kit contained instruments Putnam had never seen. There were scalpels with unusual curved blades designed for cutting in ways that seemed more suited to butchery than surgery. Small saws with teeth arranged for cutting through bone, and various bottles containing powders and liquids with odors unlike any known pharmaceuticals. When Putnam asked to examine these substances, Hawthorne would deflect with elaborate explanations about family secrets and sacred knowledge that loses its power when shared with those who haven't been properly initiated. The breakthrough in understanding Hawthorne's true nature came when young Timothy Prescott made a discovery that would change everything. While exploring the woods behind the Thornbury house, Timothy found what he first thought was an animal's den or a cave-in from an old mine shaft. The opening was partially concealed by fallen logs and snow. But as he investigated more closely, he realized someone had been using the cave-like space as a carefully organized storage site. The opening led to a natural chamber expanded and modified to create a sophisticated cache. The walls were lined with what appeared to be treated animal hides, but the texture was unfamiliar. Inside this hidden repository, wrapped in the same strange leather-like material as Hawthorne's clothes, were items that made Timothy's blood run cold. There were clothes, men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all carefully folded but damaged in ways that suggested they'd been cut away from their owners. Some bore dark stains Timothy instinctively recognized as blood. The clothing represented styles from different regions and time periods, suggesting this collection had been assembled over years from many sources. More disturbing were the personal items: wedding rings, pocket watches, women's jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, religious items, dozens of small objects families would never willingly abandon. Each was carefully cleaned and organized, as if they were trophies. But what truly terrified Timothy was the collection of detailed sketches he found wrapped in oiled cloth. They were anatomical drawings showing the human body in ways that seemed designed for butchery rather than healing. The drawings included careful notations about optimal cutting points for maximum yield, preservation methods for extended storage, and preparation techniques for various forms of consumption. Some sketches showed techniques for breaking down large game animals with instructions for field dressing, but others clearly depicted human forms with similar notations, treating the human body as simply another source of protein. The clinical precision suggested their creator had extensive hands-on experience. Timothy ran home and told his father, who initially dismissed the story as winter fever imagination. But Jeremiah Prescott was a practical man who trusted his son's observations. When Timothy led him to the cache, even he couldn't explain away what they discovered. The most chilling find was a journal written in the same careful handwriting as Hawthorne's maps. The entries were dated going back over 3 years, describing what the author called expeditions into the mountains and encounters with traveling parties and isolated families. The journal detailed these encounters with clinical precision, describing the author's growing expertise in field preservation of resources and maintaining supplies during extended isolation periods. As Jeremiah read, a horrifying pattern emerged. The journal described a systematic process of stalking and trapping travelers, particularly vulnerable families or small groups. The author had developed techniques for approaching victims under the guise of offering assistance, then isolating them in locations where they could be killed and processed without discovery. One entry dated nearly 18 months before Hawthorne's arrival described an encounter with a family of 5 traveling to Albany. The journal detailed how the author had offered to guide them through a mountain pass to save them travel time, only to lead them into a trap during a storm. What followed was described with clinical precision, detailing how each family member had been killed and their bodies processed for meat and other materials. The journal revealed this wasn't random violence. It was a calculated system for obtaining human flesh for consumption and for use in the medicines Hawthorne had been administering. The author described human meat as the most nutritionally complete protein available and detailed various preservation and preparation methods. Most disturbing were the entries describing the psychological effects of consuming human flesh, both on the author and on others gradually introduced to the practice. The journal documented a systematic process of breaking down normal human revulsion through gradual conditioning, starting with small amounts mixed into other foods and medicines, then gradually increasing the proportion until the subject was consuming pure human tissue without realizing it. The journal described how this process created psychological changes that made subjects more susceptible to suggestion and more willing to participate in activities they would normally find abhorrent. The author had apparently used this technique to create accomplices in previous communities. As Jeremiah finished reading the most recent entries, he realized with horror that everything described was currently being implemented in Millbrook. Hawthorne wasn't just feeding the townspeople human flesh, he was systematically converting them into a community of cannibals who would eventually be willing accomplices. Armed with this horrifying evidence, Jeremiah Prescott faced an impossible decision. The man who had saved his neighbors' lives was apparently something far more monstrous. But how do you accuse your town's savior of being a serial killer and cannibal, especially when people were still recovering from the illnesses he'd cured? The evidence was overwhelming, but Prescott realized simply presenting it might not be enough. Hawthorne had built enormous goodwill. People might dismiss the evidence as fabricated. Prescott decided to confide first in Dr. Putnam, hoping the educated man might help him understand what they were dealing with and develop a strategy for exposing Hawthorne. Putnam's reaction was immediate and visceral. He'd been harboring his own suspicions for weeks, and Prescott's discovery confirmed his worst fears. Together, they began a more systematic investigation. Putnam started asking Hawthorne more pointed questions about his medical training, pressing for specific details. Hawthorne's answers were always vague, filled with references to master healers in distant lands and ancient knowledge that loses its power when shared with those who haven't been properly initiated. When Putnam suggested they document Hawthorne's techniques for medical journals, the stranger became visibly agitated. He insisted his methods were not meant for outside eyes and that sharing them would strip them of their power. Meanwhile, Prescott quietly began researching disappearances in the region, using his merchant connections to gather information. What he discovered painted a terrifying pattern stretching far beyond anything he had suspected. Families traveling through mountain passes had vanished with alarming frequency over the past 4 years. Hunting parties had failed to return. Lone travelers had disappeared, leaving behind abandoned wagons or campsites. In each case, disappearances occurred during winter months when harsh weather made searches impossible. The most chilling discovery came when Prescott found records of similar incidents stretching back over 7 years, following a trail that moved systematically through Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. Each area would experience mysterious disappearances lasting 2 to 3 years, followed by reports of helpful strangers with medical knowledge who appeared during crises. In the mountain town of Grafton, Vermont in 1844, a mysterious healer named Samuel Hawthorne had appeared during a diphtheria outbreak, saving dozens before disappearing in spring along with several families. In North Conway, New Hampshire during the harsh winter of 1845, a man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne had provided assistance during a food shortage, only to vanish when investigators began asking questions. The pattern was identical in each location: arrival during a crisis, establishment of trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of strange practices, and eventually either the conversion of the entire community or the elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation. Dr. Putnam made his own disturbing discovery while conducting a more thorough examination of Hawthorne's preserved medicines. Using chemical tests from his medical training, Putnam confirmed his worst suspicions. The medicines contained human tissue from multiple individuals, suggesting Hawthorne had access to a large supply of human remains. More horrifying was Putnam's realization that the medicines were designed to be psychologically addictive. Chemical analysis revealed compounds that affected brain function, making patients crave continued treatment while making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The miraculous recoveries weren't just the result of effective medicine, they were the product of a sophisticated system of chemical conditioning. When Dr. Putnam attempted to confront Hawthorne, the man's reaction was swift and terrifying in its casual honesty. Rather than denying the accusations, Hawthorne seemed almost relieved. "You don't understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes taking on a predatory gleam. "In the places I've been, the boundaries between medicine and other necessities become meaningless when survival is at stake." The human body provides what the human body needs if one has the knowledge and the will to use it properly. Hawthorne continued with the calm precision of a professor. Your civilized society has created artificial taboos around the most natural and efficient forms of sustenance. My people learned long ago that these taboos are luxury attitudes that only the weak and well-fed can afford. When winter comes, when food runs out, when death stalks every household, such squeamishness becomes not just foolish, but actively harmful to survival. Putnam left convinced Samuel Hawthorne wasn't just a killer. He was a cannibal who had perfected his methods over years, using medical knowledge to justify his activities while developing techniques for converting entire communities. The situation in Millbrook began to escalate rapidly as more townspeople started exhibiting behavioral changes. The craving for meat became more pronounced, with several families reporting members would wake in the night to consume whatever protein they could find, often raw. Children began playing violent games involving detailed discussions of butchering. Adults started hoarding personal items from deceased community members, displaying possessive behaviors that seemed predatory. Most disturbing was the way townspeople began to regard outsiders with suspicious calculation. When a lost traveler stumbled into Millbrook during a March snowstorm, several residents gathered to observe him with expressions Dr. Putnam described as the look of hungry wolves evaluating potential prey. The breaking point came when Grace Thornbury's youngest daughter, Mary, began experiencing symptoms that made clear how far Hawthorne's influence had spread. The 8-year-old developed an insatiable hunger for raw meat and began having vivid nightmares about the hungry people in the snow who wanted to share their feast. Grace found Mary in the cellar at midnight, gnawing on a raw piece of salted pork with an expression of pure animal hunger, her hands and face smeared with blood. When her mother tried to take the meat away, Mary growled, bared her teeth, and prepared to bite. The child's eyes held the same pale, predatory gleam as Hawthorne's. When she spoke, her voice carried his unsettling cadence. The teacher says we must learn to eat what the mountain provides. He says the old people were wrong to waste so much good food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. He says when we learn the right way to eat, we'll never be hungry again and we'll never have to fear the winter. Grace realized with horror that her daughter had been systematically conditioned to accept cannibalism as desirable and that this was happening throughout the community. That same night, Thomas Thornbury discovered Samuel Hawthorne in the family's barn, working by candlelight over what appeared to be a large piece of meat on the workbench. But as Thomas looked more closely, he realized with sick certainty that what Hawthorne was cutting was unmistakably human. Hawthorne was working with practiced efficiency, his strange surgical tools gleaming as he separated different cuts and wrapped them in treated cloth. Around him were containers holding organs and other body parts, all carefully labeled with symbols from his journal. When Hawthorne noticed Thomas watching, he didn't show shame or alarm. Instead, he smiled and gestured for Thomas to come closer. "Ah, Thomas," Hawthorne said calmly. "Perfect timing. I was hoping someone in the family would take interest in learning these techniques. Your children are showing remarkable progress. It would be beneficial for you to understand the practical aspects." Thomas stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This came from the traveler who passed through last week," Hawthorne said, indicating the meat. "Poor fellow was already dying from exposure when I found him. Rather than let such valuable resources go to waste, I've been preserving what can be used for the community's benefit. The medicine I prepared for your daughter Mary included portions of this tissue. That's why her recovery was so remarkably complete." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. This man had been feeding human flesh to his children. "You're feeding my family, human beings," Thomas whispered. "I'm feeding your family the most nutritious and spiritually powerful sustenance available," Hawthorne corrected calmly. "In my homeland, we understand that consumption creates bonds between people that go deeper than ordinary social relationships. Those who share in the sacred feast become part of an eternal community." Hawthorne set down his tools, his pale eyes gleaming with evangelical fervor. "Your family is being transformed, Thomas. Your children are being prepared for a life where they will never again fear hunger, cold, or isolation. They are learning to see the world as it truly is, a place where the strong survive by consuming the weak, where waste is the only sin, and where every death provides opportunity for continued life. Asterisk. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook intensifies beyond anything the townspeople could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because what Thomas Thornbury witnessed in his barn was only the beginning of Samuel Hawthorne's final revelation. The confrontation determining Millbrook's fate came on March 15, 1847, during what would be remembered as the bloodiest night in the town's history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott had spent the previous day gathering evidence and allies, finally convincing Reverend Greenfield and several other town leaders that Samuel Hawthorne posed a mortal threat. The decision to act had been forced by increasingly desperate circumstances. More townspeople were exhibiting psychological conditioning. Children were disappearing and returning with blood on their clothes. Several families reported finding human remains hidden in their cellars. The plan was to arrest Hawthorne quietly and search his belongings for evidence. But Hawthorne had been watching the community's leaders just as carefully. When the group of 6 men, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, innkeeper Joshua Foresk, Abigail's brother-in-law from Bennington, and town constable Marcus Hartwell approached the Thornbury house that evening, they found the scene transformed into a nightmare. The house was eerily quiet, but candlelight flickered from every window, creating dancing shadows. The silence was broken only by a low rhythmic sound between singing and chanting. Thomas Thornbury met them at the door, but the man who greeted them was no longer the farmer they had known. Something was wrong with his eyes. They held the same vacant, predatory expression as Hawthorne's followers, but intensified. His movements were fluid like a predator, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper. Behind him, Grace Thornbury stood motionless, her hands stained with what looked like blood, her dress torn and stained. Her face wore an expression of beatific calm that was more terrifying than madness. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," Thomas said in a voice that didn't sound like his own, carrying Hawthorne's accent. "About the communion that binds communities together in the deepest winter and the sacred responsibilities that come with understanding the real nature of sustenance. Would you like to learn?" Dr. Putnam pushed past Thomas, his medical training overriding his fear. What he found inside was a scene that would haunt him for life, a nightmare combining religious ritual with butchery. The furniture had been rearranged to create a primitive altar in the main room. The dining table served as the focal point, surrounded by chairs in a perfect circle. Around this altar sat the remaining Thornbury family, Grace, Sarah, Mary, and William, along with several neighbors, all with the same empty predatory expressions. In the center, Samuel Hawthorne knelt beside the table, which was covered with a white cloth soaked with dark stains. On it lay what Dr. Putnam initially thought was butchered livestock. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized with sick certainty the remains were human. The body had been dismembered with surgical precision, different cuts arranged for some grotesque feast. Around the table were containers holding organs and body parts, all prepared and labeled. The clinical precision combined with the ritualistic arrangement suggested this wasn't random violence, but a carefully planned ceremony. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said without looking up, his voice calm. "Perfect timing. We were just conducting the final stage of young Mary's initiation into the deeper mysteries of survival. You see, theoretical knowledge can only take one so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast." Hawthorne stood slowly, his surgical tools gleaming. "The families that disappeared in the mountains didn't die of cold or starvation, Doctor. They became part of something much larger. They contributed to the survival of someone who could use their resources more efficiently." Dr. Putnam realized with horror that everyone in the room was staring at him and his companions with barely controlled hunger, their eyes tracking every movement like predators evaluating prey. Whatever Hawthorne had done had transformed them at a fundamental level. "You've been drugging them," Putnam whispered, conditioning them chemically and psychologically to accept. "To embrace the truth," Hawthorne interrupted, his voice fervent, "that your civilized society has spent centuries trying to deny, that survival requires the strong to consume the weak, that waste is the greatest sin, and that the human body provides the most perfect sustenance for human life. Hawthorne gestured toward the body parts with pride. In my homeland, which exists wherever winter is coldest, we learned that human fellowship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few capable of leading through the darkest times. These people have been transformed from weak, fearful creatures into something stronger, more unified, more capable of surviving whatever this harsh world can inflict. Reverend Greenfield found his voice. You're talking about cannibalism, about murder, about turning these people into monsters like yourself, abandoning every principle that separates human beings from wild beasts. Hawthorne's laugh was chilling, not a madman's, but genuinely amused. Monsters, Reverend. Look around. These people are healthier than they've been all winter. Their children are growing strong. Their families are unified in purpose. I've given them something more valuable than your abstract moral principles. I've given them the tools and mindset to survive anything. The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the men had experienced. Hawthorne's converts attacked with savage coordination, moving like a pack of predators. Their movements were fluid and practiced, suggesting this wasn't their first time defending their community. Thomas Thornbury moved with inhuman speed, his hands becoming claws that raked Constable Hartwell's face before he could draw his weapon. Grace produced a butcher's knife and advanced on Reverend Greenfield with focused determination. Most horrifying were the children. Sarah, Mary, and William attacked with coordination, speaking of extensive training. Their small size let them move underneath defenses, while their complete lack of fear made them dangerous. They had been transformed into something no longer quite human. Dr. Putnam found himself fighting for his life against people he had known and treated for years. Their personalities, moral frameworks, and understanding of right and wrong had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt. The battle was desperate and chaotic, fought with farm tools, knives, and bare hands. The converts fought with ferocity, defending their entire worldview, while the town leaders fought with the desperation of men who understood failure meant not just death, but the complete corruption of everything they held sacred. Dr. Putnam barely escaped, carrying word of the horror to the rest of Millbrook while bleeding from multiple wounds. Joshua Foresk managed to reach his horse and ride toward Bennington for help, though he would never make it. The others, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, and Constable Hartwell, disappeared into the nightmare. By dawn, half the remaining population was mobilizing to end Samuel Hawthorne's reign. But they were no longer fighting a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized community of converts systematically prepared for this confrontation, who regarded the approaching townspeople not as neighbors, but as enemies threatening everything they valued. The siege of the Thornbury house lasted 3 days and nights, a nightmare of urban warfare between former neighbors who no longer recognized each other as human. The unconverted townspeople, led by Dr. Putnam and a few other leaders, found themselves fighting for the soul of their community. Samuel Hawthorne had prepared with characteristic thoroughness. The house was fortified with barricades and defensive positions suggesting months of planning. The converts had stockpiled weapons, food, and medical supplies. Most disturbing, they fought with coordination and tactical knowledge indicating extensive training in organized violence. The unconverted townspeople quickly realized they were outmatched. Hawthorne's followers moved with fluid coordination, using terrain to their advantage, employing ambush tactics and psychological warfare. But perhaps their most effective weapon was the converts themselves. Seeing former neighbors, friends, and family transformed into predatory creatures willing to kill and cannibalize anyone had a devastating psychological effect. Many couldn't bring themselves to use lethal force against people they had known since childhood. Dr. Putnam documented the siege in journal entries, providing the most detailed account of what experts now consider one of the most successful examples of mass psychological conversion in American history. His writings describe heartbreaking moments when fathers fought their own children, when wives faced husbands across barricades, when fundamental bonds of community and family were revealed to be fragile. On the morning of the third day, the siege ended not with victory, but with the complete disappearance of Samuel Hawthorne and his most devoted followers. When the exhausted townspeople finally broke through, they found the house empty except for evidence of hasty departure. Hawthorne and his converts had vanished into the mountains, taking supplies, weapons, and preserved food, allowing them to survive indefinitely. The aftermath left Millbrook a broken community that would never recover. Of the 43 people who had fallen under his influence, only 12 were ever seen again. They trickled back over weeks and months, hollow-eyed and refusing to speak about their experiences. Most left Millbrook within a year, unable to bear memories or suspicious looks. Some moved to distant cities, others disappeared into the American frontier. Dr. Putnam spent his remaining years documenting everything about Hawthorne's methods, teachings, and the systematic process of transformation. His journals, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society's restricted archives, provide the most detailed account of what experts believe was one of America's first recorded cases of mass psychological conditioning used to override fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence was damning. When spring arrived, search parties found multiple cache sites containing preserved human remains and personal effects from dozens of missing persons spanning years. The scale became clear. Hawthorne had been operating throughout New England for at least a decade. The cache sites revealed sophisticated permanent supply depots throughout the wilderness, each containing equipment for butchering, preserving, and storing human flesh, along with chemical supplies for medicines. The organization suggested Hawthorne was not working alone, but part of a larger network. The most disturbing discovery came in late April when a hunter found a permanent settlement deep in the mountains. The site included sophisticated food preservation equipment, unusual medical instruments, workshops for producing tools and clothing, and detailed journals documenting experiments in survival psychology. These journals revealed his activities weren't random predation, but part of a carefully planned experiment in creating self-sustaining communities based on post-civilizational survival protocols. His goal was to develop techniques for maintaining human communities during societal collapse using methods abandoning conventional moral constraints for pure survival efficiency. The journals described similar experiments in other isolated communities over 15 years, each following the same pattern: infiltration during crisis, establishment of trust, gradual introduction of unconventional practices, systematic psychological conditioning, and finally either complete conversion or elimination of witnesses followed by relocation. Most chilling were entries describing long-term plans for expansion. Hawthorne had identified dozens of vulnerable communities and developed comprehensive strategies for infiltration and conversion. His vision was a network of cannibalistic communities supporting each other through harsh winters and societal disruptions, gradually spreading his philosophy throughout isolated regions and beyond. The journals also revealed Hawthorne was not the architect, but a field operative for a larger organization dedicated to developing survival strategies for anticipated societal collapse. References to the council and the directors suggested his work was monitored and guided by individuals with extensive resources. Samuel Hawthorne himself was never captured despite extensive searches by local authorities, federal marshals, and military units. No trace was found, leading to speculation. Some theorized he died in the wilderness, others believed he moved on. The truth may be more disturbing. In 1851, reports surfaced from northern Maine of a helpful stranger during harsh winters. In 1854, similar reports came from remote New Hampshire, a man with pale eyes and medical knowledge. Each incident followed the Millbrook pattern. The last confirmed sighting was in 1859 in a northern Michigan mining camp during a brutal winter. Witnesses described a man with pale eyes and prematurely streaked hair claiming to come from distant lands beyond the great forests where the old ways are honored. He helped for 3 months, his medicines effective, his advice on preservation keeping the camp supplied. When spring arrived and supply wagons reached the camp, Hawthorne had vanished, taking 12 miners never seen again. Mining company records discovered later included disturbing details about the condition of the camp. Remaining miners displayed behavioral changes consistent with Millbrook survivors. Dr. Putnam's final journal entry, written before his death from pneumonia in 1863, contained a warning haunting researchers for over a century. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer to ignore, that under the right conditions, with proper techniques and sufficient patience, anyone can be convinced the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. He didn't create monsters from ordinary people. He revealed the monsters that already existed within them, waiting for permission to emerge. Putnam's warning proved prophetic. The American Civil War, beginning 14 years after Millbrook, provided numerous examples of ordinary citizens committing unthinkable atrocities. Industrial disasters and social upheavals of the late 19th century demonstrated how quickly civilized communities could descend into savage competition for resources. Modern psychological research has confirmed many of Dr. Putnam's observations about Hawthorne's techniques. Studies of cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and survival psychology have identified the same basic principles: gradual introduction of extreme concepts, creation of dependency, isolation from alternative viewpoints, and systematic breaking down of moral boundaries through incremental steps. This mystery shows the greatest horrors often come not from supernatural forces, but from systematic exploitation of human psychology by individuals who understand how to manipulate our deepest instincts. The story of Samuel Hawthorne reminds us civilization is fragile, and the line between healer and destroyer, teacher and corrupter, can disappear when survival becomes the only virtue. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there be more to Samuel Hawthorne's true identity and the organization he served? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really drove this man and whether his network might still exist in remote areas. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history and want more, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that make you question how much we really know about the people around us. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that authorities tried to bury forever.